Hello, how y'all doing? Good? All right, all right. Well, hello and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Sydney. I'm a bookseller here where we now host in-person events, virtual events, along with partnered events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything confirmed, feel free to go to our website, politics-prose.com. And so before we get started today, I'd like to ask y'all to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. While we've lifted the mask mandate here in the store, you're encouraged to wear a mask. We can provide one for you if you don't have one. When we open up the floor to your questions, please line up at the standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right so that everyone can hear your question. We're live streaming today's program, so you or anyone you know can find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. And so following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table. So if you've not already purchased the book, we have plenty of copies available for purchase at the front behind the registers. We'll ask you to line up also starting here at this pillar. We'll come by, ask your name for personalization, so please have your books ready for us. And once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help us out a little bit. And so now, without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome Kidada E. Williams, celebrating the release of I Saw Death Coming, a history of terror and survival in the war against Reconstruction. Kidada E. Williams is an associate professor of history at Wayne State University. She is the author of They Left Great Marks on Me, co-author of Charleston Syllabus, and creator of the podcast Seizing Freedom. Williams has been interviewed on NPR's Morning Edition and On Point, and her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Slate, and multiple scholarly journals. She lives in Detroit. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Kidada E. Williams.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's such an honor to be here. I also want to thank the organizers and my editor, Ben Hyman, who's here tonight. Thank you all so much. Abe and Eliza Lyon were lined up on the starting blocks of freedom when slavery was abolished. Having dreamed of this moment for most of their remembered lives, they sprinted to fulfill their visions of self-determination and prosperity. By 1870, the Alabama couple had accomplished a great deal. Abe was 30 years old, Eliza was 35. They got legally married and set up their home in a little village in Choctaw County. Abe was working as a blacksmith from his own shop. Eliza left her job in domestic service and was keeping her own house, only occasionally working on the plantation for some extra money. They had amassed a hoard of hogs, a significant investment that indicates they were producing cured meats and breeding specifically for the market. Their 3 children, William, Ella, and Annie, were enrolled in the local school. Through their combined industry, Abe and Eliza had saved $600, the relative worth of which is more than $200,000 today. And they planned to move to Demopolis, buy property, and build a home of their own. Secession and the founding of the Confederacy were less than a decade in the past. Barely 5 years separated Abe and Eliza from the end of the bloody Civil War. They were living their best post-emancipation life. And I think that's important to acknowledge because their testimonies and the records make clear that they made the most of freedom. And their achievements provide context for why Confederates targeted them in what I call the war after the Civil War, the one white Southerners waged on African Americans' freedom. Like many of you, when I was in school, I either was not taught anything about Reconstruction or I was taught that it failed. And what no one said outright was that Black people were freed from slavery, given every chance possible to succeed, they got the rights and the vote, and that they failed to make the most of it. That's not what people say, but that's what the failure narrative means. That never made sense to me, but this is what I learned in school. So like many, I moved on to research other more worthy topics. But something kept drawing me to Reconstruction. And the more I trained as a professional historian, and the more I researched the records of the era, the more I recognized what a truly transformative moment this was. There were so many revolutionary developments: abolition, the opening of schools, the opening of hundreds of independent churches, a boom in Black land ownership and entrepreneurship, national citizenship rights and protections, voting rights for black men, and black office holding, that the historian Eric Foner has called it the second founding after the American Revolution. Abe and Eliza Lyon were part of what some historians call the Second American Revolution. They had joined more than 4 million other black people who snatched freedom from Confederates and tried to live upright and build morally just worlds after slavery. By 1870, black Southerners had picked themselves up. They had reassembled their families to the best of their ability. They worked harder for themselves than they did for the people who held them in bondage. They established their churches, communities, schools, orphanages. Some acquired land and opened their own businesses like Abe. Others were working, being industrious, saving money with their eyes on the prize of their own homesteads. And to protect all these rights and to secure their families' futures, black men wanted to vote and serve in office. Now, Confederates saw these strides African Americans had made as a threat to their ongoing mastery, and they fought to sustain their privileges in the American system. They launched a torrent of attacks on black people who were reaping the rewards of Reconstruction's expansion of freedom and democracy. In the spring of 1866, white men in Pulaski, Tennessee, formed social clubs in which they sometimes donned masks and elaborate costumes and performed musical entertainment. The white men called themselves Ku Klux, after the Greek word circle. Klansmen's activities quickly spread across the South and evolved to roaming around, armed through communities in the middle of the night, conducting paramilitary attacks on black and white Southerners. Extremists and their apologists often refer to these raids euphemistically as visits, masking their brutality behind the veneer of a friendly social call. Klansmen's work gave rise to an extremist movement that became so widespread that any white man or group of white men who wanted to intimidate or kill their targets might be associated with it, whether they were affiliated with the Klan or not. And as more white Southern men mustered into the Klan's ranks and experimented with their acts of terror, they grew more deadly. White extremists targeted black people with regularity and shocking impunity. They shot down black male voters at the polls. They stalked black office holders and sometimes offered them bribes to leave office and assassinated them if that didn't work. They kidnapped black men and women at gunpoint and disappeared them, disposing of their bodies in waterways and woods or just on the roads. They also ambushed African American families with nighttime raids, which are like home invasions. And during these visits, white men holding black families hostage subjected them to humiliation, torture, and murder. And there were countless massacres and mass killing events. Now, it's important to acknowledge that black people resisted this violence in ways that made sense to them in the moment. Some hid or fled, others bore arms, defending their homes, injuring or killing their attackers. But extremist violence was so widespread that black Southerners often found themselves outmanned and outgunned. Thousands of black men, women, and children were injured and killed. And that's why the failure narrative of Reconstruction is so problematic. Reconstruction didn't fail. White Southerners violently overthrew it, and white Northerners and Westerners essentially let them. I Saw Death Coming tells that story, but shows how black people understood and articulated the human costs of Reconstruction's overthrow and abandonment. And it does that through stories like that of Abe and Eliza. On June 6, 1871, Abe had spent the day in his blacksmithing shop, and Eliza had finished her homemaking tasks. The children completed their chores and lessons with some time for play after. They were all in bed at home at 11 p.m. when someone knocked on the door and asked if Abe was home. The family never heard any threats and were not thinking about such a thing, Eliza later said. And that's why Abe answered that he was home, and he got up from the bed to open the door. But something, perhaps the sight or sound of the visitors and the awareness of the threat they posed, or just a feeling, his skin tightening and puckering with goosebumps, so terrified Abe that he didn't move. Human minds and bodies are wired to sustain themselves, and when under attack, focus solely on survival and avoiding injury. When the mind detects threats to life, like Abe experienced, it triggers pre-programmed escape plans by secreting stress chemicals to propel the body into action, specifically to survive by running, hiding, or fighting. But for some people, the unthinkable happens. Their brain's defense circuitry shuts down, and they freeze. And this is what happened to Abe. He might have felt heavy, as though he were in a nightmare from which he might soon awaken. But this wasn't a dream, and that horrified him. Eliza, who remained calm, said Abe looked like he was in a perfect scare, suggesting that he was completely paralyzed by fear. And Abe remained in that trance-like state, prompting Eliza to act in hopes of guiding her husband to safety and protecting herself and their children. So Eliza grabbed Abe, trying to steer him out the back door. He was so scared, Eliza said. He just wheeled around the room in that scare, not knowing what to do. Eliza's hope that her husband would regain control of his senses was soon dashed. The invaders burst through the door and threw a rope over his head and dragged him outside and away from their home. Eliza yelled to her neighbors and any passers-by for help, but no one came. To silence her screams, the attackers drew their guns on her. They told me if I didn't hush hollering, they would blow a hole right through me, she said. Eliza knocked away one gun with her hand. The men held fire, but Eliza said they told her they would finish with me directly. The night riders carried Abe away from his home and up a hill nearby. Eliza didn't follow. Soon she saw the flash and heard the blast of a double-barreled shotgun. Then one of the men shouted an order for the rest of the gang to fire, and they did. After the terrorists killed Abe, Eliza spotted about 75 men returning to her house. I knew they were going to kill me, she said. So she ran inside to gather her children to flee, but her son William had disappeared. Moving with her daughters by her side, Eliza snuck out back to a field neighboring her home. They stopped at a thicket of woods to monitor the men's activities and take stock. But Eliza could go no farther without knowing William's whereabouts. But staying put rendered her girls and her vulnerable to discovery. Eliza and the girls watched from the woods as the white men made up a light and began searching and ransacking their home. They tore up everything, she said. Wearing only their night clothes, Eliza and the girls moved farther into the woods as the night riders shot up their home. It sounded like there was over 100 shots at once, she said. She and the girls remained hidden until sunrise, when she could see the men had left. That's when she went to confirm Abe's killing, and then find William. Eliza and the children lost Abe, their cash, all their possessions, that year's crop, their hogs, and most of Abe's tools. Their home had been destroyed, and the white men's knowledge that they left an adult witness meant that it probably wasn't safe for the family to continue living on the homestead. Eliza reported what happened to authorities. A grand jury was convened to investigate the spate of attacks that had happened in the community. But many witnesses were too afraid to talk. Initially, Eliza wasn't afraid. It's not clear who or what spooked her, but Eliza and the children shot out of Choctaw County. En route, she heard Abe's killers were pursuing them, but she and the children managed to pick up their pace and safely made it to Demopolis, where she thought they might be safe. And so this violence is happening in communities across the South. And receiving a flood of reports of attacks like the ones on Eliza's family, Congress convened an investigation. And what they want to do is investigate the safety of the lives and property of U.S. citizens, is what they said. And the committee's work became known as the Klan hearings because of how prominently this violence, particularly of these visits, featured in the investigation. So lawmakers travel south to these hot spots of disorder, and they solicit testimonies from office holders, voters, accused perpetrators, and their victims. Families like Eliza and Abe's had greeted emancipation with great expectations. Many of them achieved their dreams of freedom, or were on their way to doing so when the white men came for them. When Congress issued the call for witnesses, they stepped forward, hoping to convince federal officials to take action to end the violence so their families could live in peace, pursue their dreams, and secure their children's futures. Eliza Lyon, now a widow, lost everything. Displaced from her home, community, and support network, she was struggling to care for herself and her children when she testified, which is exactly what their attackers intended, to destroy everything Black people built and leave them with nothing. But facing the prospect that the world wouldn't know what white Southerners did to them, that there might not be some form of redress, that free Black futures might be forestalled, survivors like Eliza stepped forward at great risk to themselves and their families and reported what happened. And as they told their stories, they revealed how much they had gained with freedom and what they were now losing to white violence. Eliza and other survivors' decision to testify was informed by their individual and collective sense of self-love, self-respect, and what Toni Morrison called self-regard. Targeted people's testimonies provided counter-narrative to the stories we've been told about Reconstruction's supposed failure. Speaking with one voice, they said white Southerners were waging war on Reconstruction by attacking those who were making the most of freedom. In naming their attackers, detailing their injuries, saying the names of their slain kin, crying out for justice, and keeping the record alive, African American survivors said Black people's lives, freedoms, and futures mattered. Reporting and testifying about the war on freedom were survivors' defense against its erasure. These testimonies did help drive the federal investigation that drove the Klan underground, but not before they seriously undercut freedom. In I Saw Death Coming, I used testimonies like hers to challenge the failure narrative of Reconstruction by highlighting the story of African Americans who leapt from the frying pan of slavery into the fires of freedom. Understanding Black family stories of racing into freedom and the price white extremists made them pay in the war against it, Americans learned that the arc of history doesn't always bend towards justice. The real story is essential to understanding why more than a century and a half later, our struggle for justice continues today. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nathan Weissler, and I'm a recent college graduate from the Washington, D.C. area, and I've always had a strong interest in history. My question is, I started reading the book, and I found particularly meaningful reading about the reunion of Mary Stowers and her son, Willis Green. Would you be able to speak some about that, please?
So the reunion of the mother and son who had been separated before the Civil War.
Yes. Yes.
And okay, so one of the things that happens is African Americans after the Civil War, one of the main things they do is prioritize reuniting their families. And a lot of times those efforts are unsuccessful. People have died, they've moved on, they don't have accurate information. But there are some stories like Mary's where they are able to relocate, they are able to locate their kin. And in this story, she had been looking for her son. And she happens to be in a community where he is, and she reaches out to someone, and he is, I believe this is that case because there are a number of them, he is doubtful about whether or not she is actually his mother. And so he asks for information, and she's able to tell him about an injury that he got, like how he managed to get that injury. And so based upon the records that we have, we believe that they had a happy reunion after that. So, but I think it's an example of one of the things that I do in the book is center African American African American families. And in doing that, drawing attention to stories like that makes clear how much they prioritize family and how they saw having their people, having their families was crucial to their understandings of freedom. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for the book and for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm thinking about the level of violence during Reconstruction, particularly around elections. And I'm always astounded when I think about how many black men are elected to office in spite of this violence. Like there's like 600, I think, like legislators around the country who are black men. And I'm always curious, like how did that happen with all of the violence that we know happened in, like, when I think about things like Wilmington, North Carolina. Right. So how did they manage that, even though some of them might not have been in office for very long, but even the amount that they were? Right. So how?
Right. So they're able to accomplish that because as a result of slavery, what you have are a number of counties in Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, where there are black majorities in a county, right? And so that's when you see like a number of black elected officials. So there are 600 in the state legislature, but there are like 1,400 total when you sort of go beyond the state legislature and you go down to local level offices. So they're elected in various capacities because they're in those communities with a very large black population. And some of them are able to withstand the violence, but others are driven out of it. So they are able to get into office because they know their numbers. But the people who are targeting know those numbers too. And so that's one of the reasons why they're going to deliberately target them with violence.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, so they're able to elect them because they're in communities where there are black majorities, and they are voting for other black people who are going to advance their interests.
Thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, Ronald.
Good to see you.
One of the great producers from Seizing Freedom. Our creator, Kelly Hardcastle Jones, is in the back, trying to turn her head so we don't see her. That's okay, Kelly. I see you.
First of all, very proud of you. Very
Thank
happy
you.
to be here. Very happy you're going to sign my book. I have a question that's kind of connected to your book tangentially. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I like hearing you talk about this stuff. You know how I feel. So knowing that there's kind of a battle for history right now, like things are changing. We can see like recent news events and all that. As a historian, do you have a take on like kind of the responsibility of those who teach history and those who are learning history in order to like kind of go towards the future with a lens on telling the truth?
Yes, absolutely. And to do it even if their voices shake, and to sort of form partnerships with other historians to draw attention to efforts to silence them, and to draw inspiration from earlier generations of educators who made a point to continue educating people. You've got the educators of African Americans during slavery who are violating laws that deny Black people access to literacy. Their teaching is still happening. Clandestine schools are all over the place. Learning is happening. And even during Jim Crow, when you've got the significant defunding of Black schools, you do have people in those communities, Black and white, who are doing their best to provide education. And so the challenges that teachers are facing today may seem new, but they're not. They actually have a history, and knowing the history and knowing how teachers and their students survived and how they navigated, how they strategized to work around the law, I think can serve as a source of inspiration.
Great response.
Thank you.
Would you say a few words about the Fusion Party and the coup?
I mean, so you will have in various instances Black and white Southerners, like you will in places like Virginia, who do manage to work together for a period of time. And they're able to get some people elected into office. But the forces of white supremacy are bigger than even that Fusion Party ticket. And so they're not in office they're in office for a period of time, but they're not going to be able to sustain that long term. So did you want me to say more than that? What specifically are you interested in?
That was in North Carolina, right? The coup?
So you've got so there's a readjusted party, there's a fusion party, and it probably is in North Carolina. But what's your question about?
About the the conditions and then just the what happened.
So they're able to work together for a period of time, and then they're not. And then you're going to have the installation of Jim Crow.
Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
First, thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of Seizing Freedom.
Thank you.
And I just want to ask you, there's so much about the African American story that shows, resilience, triumph over unspeakable odds.
Right.
But the other side of that is just the horrific terror and violence and inhumanity that can be so devastatingly heavy. And I'm just asking how you, as a historian and an African American woman, hold those and are able, to not fall into burnout and living in where we live right now, where, there's so much that has not changed. There's so much that's heading in the wrong direction. They're killing this history. You can look at what's going on in Florida and across the entire country. If you could just speak to that, and thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. I think, so it's a multi-part answer. One, I think when you study history, you are already, especially African American history or Native history, you already have an understanding of the worst, right? The worst of people, the worst of Americans, but you also have a sense of the best too. And so as a historian, how I take care of myself and take care of my subjects is I try to sort of compartmentalize a lot, and to carve out time to honor their stories by not allowing any of my feelings or reaction to what I'm seeing in the archive clouded. Because I think sometimes we can do that. We can bring our own baggage to the sources, and that doesn't do them or history any good. And so I grapple with what they're trying to teach us, what we can learn from them. And then I take plenty of time off to process and reckon with, my own reaction to the horrors in the archive. So it's definitely a struggle, but I often come back to the reality that I am not experiencing this violence personally myself. And I feel like I would dishonor them by appropriating their pain and suffering. And so I try to do my best to avoid doing that. So that's not to say I don't have moments, because I have a lot of moments. But I sort of take time to sort of deal with them and then come back. But the other thing that brings me back to the sources is all of the ways that people in those records are clearly trying to take care of each other and build a more just world. And so not only the survivors themselves, but people in the receiving communities, some of the lawmakers who are trying to play a role in ending the violence. I come back to that because I think that can be a source of inspiration for those of us who are going through trying times today. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank
you
you
so much.
Good evening.
Yes.
Thank you, fellow Detroiter, for the book.
Thank you.
And unfortunately, it just came out, so I haven't read it yet. I always like to read before I talk to a person. But you talked about how one of the main goals was for families to reunite. Do you spend time in the book talking about the successes in spite of the violence?
So I talk about this in terms of the successes for reuniting the families after slavery. I do talk about that. But there are successes, and then I hate to call them failures, but there are failures, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone isn't able to relocate their kin, and it's not for lack of trying. It's because they just simply haven't been able to do that. Slavery didn't make that possible for them to do that. Mm-hmm. What I do spend more time trying to talk about is how families live with what happened to them after the violence. So how they live with themselves and each other after the attacks, because that's what their testimonies are pointing to, particularly those who are targeted by night riders. They are saying, this is how we are doing, and it is not good. It's the stories of people like Eliza who are displaced from their community, who lose their husbands, who lose everything, and they are struggling to start over. And many of them, as I said, are not doing well. So I spend more time on that. So I talk in the book about how African Americans are in the process of freedom making. And part of freedom making is reuniting with their kin if they can, establishing their communities, providing resources to make sure that children can grow up right. So they're doing all of that. But the book sort of goes from there to them being attacked for being successful in what they had made in freedom.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about history, and a book like this, I think is important. But people like Charles Barkley, I see his face over there. He's from Leeds, Alabama, where there's one part of my family. I grew up right outside of Birmingham. Mm-hmm. My family has a village. Well, there are not a lot of us, but we have a village that we have lived on that land since 1868. Mm-hmm. My family in Demopolis, where everybody was running to because it was sort of a successful place. I have family there also. So I one of the things that people don't think about when you think about Alabama, they think about the terror, they think about all the hurt and pain, but there were places where people, like you say, were resilient, who did overcome. And that was just a statement.
Right.
The second one was, do you plan to do a book about what I call the Second World War? Like, this is your First World War, but in the 1960s, that was the war that did tear my family apart. So are you planning to look at that era?
So that's not currently my plans in terms of future work. Yeah, so I think part of it, is there are historians who are doing some of that work already, looking at the 60s. There's a sort of wide range of scholarship that's looking at the 1960s. And there's even more work coming out. That's not the work that I'm doing. And so, I could, if you send me an email, I can refer you to some of the scholars who are doing that work, but it's not me for my next project.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Bruce Jacobs. I want to thank you first for your work and for bringing it to us here.
Thank you.
And, there's so many questions to ask about this. I'll only ask one, which is that I love, among other things, and I'm going to read your work. I haven't yet, but I'm glad I came, how you're one of the historians and writers and students of history who kind of joins the interpersonal and the granular and the family and village life with the broader threads of organizational and national political life. And I think you could argue that all of American history from the beginning, from slavery and the capital that it generated, has been a kind of conjoining of the personal and progress on the personal and political level with vicious reactive movements against that progress. Right. And we're in another one now. And I wonder if you have any observations or if there's any work that you're interested in that you're doing or see others doing that analyzes how our current retrenchment, you could kind of call it another de-reconstruction that's happening now, immediately after the election, not immediately, but gaining strength after the election of a black president.
Right.
What parallels and differences you see between the dynamics of that backlash and this backlash, and what threads there are in common that we might want to look at. Long question, sorry.
So there are a number of historians and political scientists who are looking at this period and who are looking at these cycles of history. And I think one example is Peniel Joseph, who's got the book, The Third Reconstruction. My only sort of quibble with that is the fact that when people talk about a third Reconstruction, they're often talking about the sort of celebratory aspects of Reconstruction. They're not talking about the backlash, right? So people, yes. So yes, and I get that. So people are saying, we need a third Reconstruction, and my pushback to that would be, which part, right? Are we talking about the first part, the revolutionary reforms? Are we talking about the backlash? Because we need to be aware of the backlash so we can try to defend against it. I think that in both instances, advocates for the revolutionary reforms, too many of them underestimated the determination of the opponents of the reforms. They underestimated them. I think they underestimated them during Reconstruction. I think they underestimated them during the Civil Rights Movement. I think people are still underestimating them today. But the history that I study has taught me that we don't have the luxury of underestimating them. We need like real clarity on the goals of people who don't necessarily believe in justice or liberty, freedom, and democracy for everyone. And as long as we remain in denial about that, we and our democracy remain vulnerable. And so I think there are a number of works. There are people who are sort of doing that work about the implications of the work today. As a historian, like I'm much more interested in, I spend most of my time looking at what happened during that period. For the issues that are going on today, like I'm encountering them and observing them much like you are. And so it's not a good answer necessarily, but it's, you know, it's kind of where I am on the issue. Like I recognize fully the world we're in today, and I am very concerned. Right. You know, I do believe that the arc will bend, you know, it can bend towards justice, but I also know that coming out of this moment is going to take a really long time. History has shown us it's going to take a really long time to come out of this. And so it's best to prepare ourselves for a long fight. And that's kind of an honest answer, I think, to the question. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for writing this important piece of history. I think the thing about untold stories is that you don't know they're untold until you know. Right. Could you talk about your research process and the discovery of that moment of you're like, this needs to be a book, and maybe if there are more untold stories that you plan?
So I think there are a lot of untold stories, too many untold stories. My editor's here, like, you know, he can tell you, like, we can't tell all of these stories. There are too many people. I think for me, what was transformative was reading a lot of the scholarship and seeing that historians had used these records to establish the fact of election violence, right? Election violence occurred. And we kind of knew that. But it was reading through the testimonies in a much slower pace, taking my time, trying to figure out where the survivor who testified wanted the sort of audience to go in terms of understanding who they were, how they pushed back on efforts to minimize what they were saying or to discredit them. And then just spending time with enough of those sources and seeing all of the things that they revealed that they accomplished with slavery and what they were losing to violence, and that it was not just about the politics, right? Historians have kind of homed in on the election aspects of it, the election violence. But what a lot of survivors said is that, yes, I lost the vote, but the vote wasn't more important than my child, right? Yes, you know, I was driven out of office, but I lost my wife in a raid. The vote isn't going to bring her back. And they're very clear on that in saying, yes, these politics, we know that that's why you members of Congress are here. But what we're here to tell you is what this violence did to our families. And so for me, it was seeing them push back, seeing them say, no, this is actually more important, right? This other stuff is important, but this is more important to me. That gave me a certain amount of clarity and made me want to tell these stories centering families and following them on their journey. And the other thing about the testimonies is that they're full of information, much more full than historians have acknowledged. They're full of information on like all of those details of what newly free people achieved in that 5 years. If you're only looking for election violence, you're going to ignore all of the other things that they managed to achieve in that process. How they organized their families, the kind of work they were doing, the kind of crops they were growing, the kind of small businesses they had. You miss all of that if you're only focused on the politics. And so I understand that historians and some people in the audience only care about the politics, but the survivors themselves said the politics isn't the only thing that matters in this. And so I wanted to honor that by telling the story that I did. And I think that even in those records, there's still a lot of untold stories. And I think part of it is that we just have to find survivors, find testimonies, find those kind of accounts, and understand who the people were and what they were trying to communicate to the world about what happened to them. And then that's how you've got all of those stories that can still be told.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that book, because I've often wondered about Reconstruction, and that I'm very excited to read.
Thank you.
My question is that there were a lot of blacks that were elected to state but also federal office.
Mm-hmm.
How were the legislators going to Washington? How were they greeted? How were they welcomed? Or not?
That's a great question. That or not matters. Because you do have white Northerners and Westerners in the federal government who welcome them with open arms. But those tend to be the progressives and the moderates. The conservatives, white conservatives in the legislature from the North and West, do not necessarily welcome them with open arms. And they experience a lot of hostility from them, a lot of sort of deliberate targeting, a lot of mocking from them, and also a lot of dismissal of the reports of violence. And so what's interesting about the reports of violence is that it's not even an open secret. Everyone knows about it. But what you have are the conservatives in the South and the North saying this violence isn't happening. This is made up. Black people lie, so you can't trust them. This is what lawmakers are actually saying. And so like their reception is mixed, depending on who they're interacting with. And so I think that matters a lot. There is one of the things I try to address in the book is everyone's familiar with the lost cause narrative of the South, but less familiar with the sort of abolitionist narrative that white Northerners created, right, after the war. And so, after the war, there is this sort of like, they're all abolitionists. They were not. And we need to be honest about that, because if they were all abolitionists, they would have put a stop to the violence, right? But they didn't. Because if anyone was in a position to end the violence, it was white Northerners and Westerners. There were more of them. They could have ended it. They chose not to. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they only begrudgingly accepted emancipation in order to end the war quickly, right? If white Northerners were all abolitionists, they could have abolished slavery any time before the war. There were more of them, right? But that's not who they were. And so there is this sort of frustration with emancipation. The Cincinnati Enquirer had an editorial that said, "Slavery is dead, the Negro is not, and there is the misfortune." So they are very clear on that. And I think we need to be clear on that, right? Because if we're clear on that, then we can understand what happened with Reconstruction. And we can understand the issues that we're still dealing with today. But as long as you've got the mythology on both sides, it's hard to sort of gain clarity on what happened and why. Yeah. And so that's I hope that my book tries to sort of address some of that. But I know that dealing with that white Northern abolitionist narrative is just as difficult as dealing with the lost cause narrative. But the records are very clear on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name's David, and thank you for your work and for sharing it this evening. Given your answer, all I have to do is kind of offer a few quick fragments. Okay. Hopefully this is not commentary or annotation, but even papers of records in Atlanta, Chicago, and of course the New York Times really ferociously attacked any efforts to affirm humanity of black folks, period, even in the face of violence. And the intermittent alleged protections, grant comparison to Johnson, for instance, and betrayals and such. But here's the point, too. Part of the mythology is this projected haplessness upon black communities and black people, and yet there were colored conventions that met. These people took time out under the threat of death to meet collectively, regionally, nationally, to talk about strategies for surviving and thriving. Right. And eclipse would be if you look throughout the South, black elected officials created a public school infrastructure that you can do a correlate today of the poorest academic performance given the rejection in cities and regions of that creation.
Right.
That's all
Yes, absolutely. And, and the thing is that black men continued voting, right? Even despite the violence, because they knew that was the only way they might be able to break the grip that Confederates had on their lives. And that because the violence wasn't enough, that's why they need disfranchisement, right? Because violence isn't enough to achieve their end result. So they do whatever they can, but they're only able to do that because they're in a position to, because of the larger forces that are happening in the nation. So yes, I completely agree. Yes, sir.
Hi, so thanks so much for coming. I just have a quick question about President Grant. I think there's been sort of a reassessment in the popular imagination of him. You have the Ron Chernow biography. I think there was a multi-part documentary series or whatever. But I'm just wondering, is this sort of reassessment that he was an honest broker who tried to, see through Reconstruction? Do you agree with this reassessment at all?
I mean, I think that there were some things that he did in terms of beefing up troop levels, but I also recognize that he was constrained by the white majority in the country that wanted to move on. Even with the sort of boosting the troop levels in the South, what he's up against is white conservatives, North, South, and West, saying the war is over, so there shouldn't be a standing army in the South, right? We're either at peace or war. Which one is it, right? And so what they're saying is that we laid down our arms, but they're not acknowledging that they lifted them against black people, right? And so Grant is aware of that, but he is not willing to upset the white majority by supplying additional resources. So at different points, he will boost those troop levels, but in the end, he kind of throws up his hands and says, this is beyond me. And he's not alone. Congress with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment added enforcement clauses. And Congress could have stepped forward to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but they chose not to, right? And they chose not to because they were acting in their own sort of sense of belief and with their constituents in mind. Many of the radical Republicans, even when, you've got the beginning of congressional Reconstruction, they're older. And so those men have died or in the process of dying by like 1872, 1873. So the lions of radical Reconstruction, they have passed on or they are ailing, they're out of Congress. And so, there isn't the incentive in Congress to enforce the law. And if Congress isn't going to do it, why should Grant do it, especially when the white majority in terms of the electorate doesn't want them to? They're more interested in moving to drive indigenous peoples off their land in the West. They're much more interested in the imperial impulse, right? The second industrial revolution. They've got other, there's a sort of like, it's time to move on from the South. And so Grant isn't the only one, right? The Grant isn't the only one we should be looking at. We should be looking at Congress. We should be looking at the larger electorate too.
If there are no more questions, I think a huge round of applause for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
So